Welcome everybody to a brand new episode of IDTALK4ED Live, the show for the unsung heroes of education. I'm your host, Kwame Sarfo-Mensah. And if this is your first time tuning in to the podcast, I welcome you and I hope that you return for future episodes, especially after watching this one, which I will tell you is going to be powerful. And then for those who are a returning listener or a viewer of the podcast, as always, I thank you for the support. I welcome you back, and I hope that today's episode is one that you will find informative, enlightening, and of course, insightful. So before we get into the conversation for today, just a reminder from my people out on YouTube, please make sure you hit that red subscribe button to get future notifications of new episodes. And if you're tuning in from Apple Podcasts or Spotify or Google Podcasts, wherever you listen to your podcast, make sure you subscribe there as well. And then also, for those who are wondering, how can we contribute to this platform so it can continue to grow and bring on these phenomenal guests? You can send your donations to either Cash App with the handle #IDTALK4ED, or you can go to Venmo with the handle @Kwame SM. That is KWAMESM. And to catch up on past episodes of the podcast, you can go to our main website at IDTALK4EDucators.com. And as always, thank y'all for the support. All right, y'all. So we got a very dope conversation coming up. I am honored to have this brother come on. This is somebody who I actually know. Someone who I went to college with, someone who actually have had the chance to work with in the same school, teaching, someone who I've been able to just see grow into his leadership, into his activism, and he's just doing a lot of things in the education activism space, and he's been doing it for a number of years, and I'm proud to know him, and I'm proud to just have him on his platform because I think it's a long time coming. And because it is Black History Month, I think it's important to have somebody of his ilk that really can provide some depth into some of the issues that are happening within the education realm and beyond. So without going too deep into it, I want to make sure we bring on today's guest, my brother, Mr. Ismael Jimenez, to the podcast to talk about what he's doing and what's next. So let's bring on brother Ismael, my brother.
Peace, bro. Thanks for that introduction. I'm flattered, bro.
Yeah, man. Yeah, man. How you been?
Good, man. Surviving these times, just trying to, speak truth regardless of all the falsehoods that are surrounding us. So you know how it is.
Yeah, man. But thank you for accepting the invitation. I've been wanting to get you on for a minute. Just need to find the right time to do it. I think there's no better time than now, given what's going on in our world, man.
Mm-hmm. Word.
Yes. So there's a lot to cover, and we have a limited amount of time. So let's get right in, man. So I know that you've been in this game for a long time, and just like I've told the audience, we've had a chance to work together. So I've seen you in action, and I know what you're about, and I know what you stand on, as an educator, spiritually and morally. But for those who don't know about you and how you were brought up into this space, I would love to give you a chance to just share who or what inspired you to want to become an educator in the first place.
Well, I mean, that's a heavy question, kind of. But
We got time.
First, I want to say that, I knew I wanted to become a high school teacher for social studies at age 16, but its roots had something much more deeper than just wanting to become. When I was in fourth grade, I was attending a majority white school, and I rose my hand to answer a question, but I used to have like this slight stuttering problem. And so when I tried to answer the question, I started stuttering. The class laughed at me. And then the teacher said, "Oh, don't mind him. His people talk like that." And again, it is fourth grade, right? My mom's a Black woman from Liverpool, and my father's Dominican and Puerto Rican, but never spoke Spanish in the household. So I'm like, in fourth grade, I'm like, my people, like, what exactly does that mean? Of course, the teacher ended up apologizing when my parents kicked up some dust, but the librarian at the school heard about the incident and passed. And I was in the library like crazy even before that. But then she passed me her original copy of the autobiography of Malcolm X in fourth grade. And I read that, John, in fourth grade, fifth grade, sixth grade. By fifth grade, kids was calling me Ishmael X, because I would always be that, like, you know what I mean? Like questioning what we're being taught, and really like being critical at a young age of what was being shown to us. And the thing that was real funny, people point to that time where they woke up and started noticing things and the way things are. It's like, I can't really point to that time because that happened so young to me. That was more in the sense of I always had that foundational base, but I didn't do good in school. I didn't believe in school at a young age as a result. And so I actually only graduated high school with a 1.6 GPA. Even my counselor was like, "Are you sure college is right for you?" I was like, "Yeah, I'm going to go to community college. I'm going to get my associates in secondary education. Then I'm going to transfer to Temple." I had it all mapped out, but nobody really believed that I was capable of it. My teachers or my counselor at the school, or even the assistant principal that oversaw the academy I was in. But luckily, I did have two great social studies teachers in high school, which really like leaned into the fact that I was so interested in talking about politics and talking about history, and that I had a knowledge base that, quite frankly, none of my classmates had. And it just kind of fed into itself. It was like, it just like kind of was suggested to me once. I don't even know who suggested it to me, but I was like, yeah, that's the route. That's the solution that I think that I want to go down. So that's how I ended up becoming a teacher. I did exactly what I said I was going to do. I got my associates in secondary education, transferred to Temple, got my bachelor's degree in secondary education with a social studies focus. And then, unfortunately, I wasn't able to teach right away because I couldn't just not work for half a year in order to student teach. And I was able to go back, get my master's in 1 year, and the job that I was at was grateful enough, or extended extra time for me to allow me to student teach while also working and maintaining a full-time position in order to feed my growing family that was already happening when I graduated with my bachelor's degree.
Wow, man. So you were Huey Freeman before Huey Freeman.
I mean, I guess, I mean, I would love to claim that title, but definitely they allowed us to wear hats in fifth grade. And this before the movie came out, right? Malcolm X movie didn't come out. I remember my fifth grade teacher was like, "Oh, Ishmael," because I was allowed to wear a Malcolm X hat. She's like, "Ishmael, you heard that they're coming out about a movie about Malcolm X?" I'm like, "Oh, really? Like, that's cool." And then when it came out, I remember critiquing it at the time too, because I was like, "Why did he leave this out? Why did he fast forward through this?"
Yeah.
So that was happening at a young age. Yeah, definitely.
Cool, man. So at home, so you said that you have your mom, Black woman from Liverpool, so UK.
Yeah.
And then your father, Dominican and Puerto Rican. And for those who know about DR and just the history there, especially with Haiti and all that, like, and it's still going on today.
Yeah.
I'm trying to get a sense of how you were able to really just embrace your Blackness, given the fact that you have two parents who are coming from different countries within the diaspora.
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, I didn't bang with the Latino side from an early age. Number one, I know the fact that my Puerto Rican grandmother didn't talk to my dad when he married my mom, because my mom was Black for like 5 years after they got married. And I
Wow.
also know that my grandfather, even though Dominican and brown skin, was the lightest of his brothers. And he held anti-Black views himself. So from a young age, they didn't bang with me. And I already read Malcolm at a young age. So like from my earliest memories, I was just like, I don't want beans and rice. I don't want to really be acknowledging your culture. Even my dad, he actually pronounced our last name Jimenez. I didn't even know it was pronounced Jimenez until I was like 16, 17 years old. But like when I was young, around 10 or 12, after reading Malcolm, he's like, you want to learn how to speak Spanish? It's like, I already know one colonializes language. Now, as I'm older, of course, I regret the fact that I didn't learn. But like
Yeah.
automatically, with my mom being Black, it was just like I didn't know any different. Plus, growing up in the Northeast, there weren't really that many Latinos around where I was growing up. The only ones I really even knew about were my grandparents, and then I also, I mean, from a young age, associated them with anti-Blackness real heavy. So like I just didn't even know how to think differently. It actually took years of recently to even reconcile kind of like that aspect of my identity, which I still kind of have a lot of harsh feelings about, because rooted within a lot of Latino identity is anti-Blackness just by
Yeah.
default. And I used to tell my students, it's like, yeah, that's like white supremacy in another language. Like I don't speak that language, but I would challenge them to even challenge their own families about how they talked about race, how they processed it, especially in the American context, because it isn't that nuanced, unfortunately.
Yeah, and that's it's very deep, man. It's just very deep. If you haven't had a chance to just even do that research, man, so many layers you have to unpack with that.
Yeah.
Um, so you kind of answered this question already. So around the time that you were given the autobiography of Malcolm X, so this is like fourth grade, right? So I would say, you're like 9, 10 years old at this
Yep.
time.
Yep.
So would that be like the first time you really fell in love with Black history? Or were there some moments that happened prior to the librarian give you that book?
Well, yeah. I mean, my mother, being a Black woman who comes to America, right? She always kind of talked about race with us. By the time I watched Roots before I read Malcolm X, basically. Also, her own experience being the only Black girl growing up on her block in Liverpool,
Mhm.
and the stuff that she experienced. She would talk to us about that because me and my sister experienced that at a young age. I'm not even dark skinned, and I was called the N word like crazy in first and second grade. Getting in fights with like I wouldn't even like try to start fights, but I would get in fights with folks about that. And I would come home and my mother would talk to us about that. Don't ever let anybody talk to you like that, that type of thing. And so like that incident happening to me, it was kind of like still like processing, obviously, because what 9 or 10-year-old at that time can like really truly process the full gravity of what that is. But then getting and reading the autobiography of Malcolm X, which my mother helped me read and process and go through, definitely really laid the foundation for me to love Black history from that age. After that, I went out and read biographies, like any biography I can get a hold of. Susan B. Anthony, I remember reading her in fourth grade. I just fell in love with history, with biography, with the struggle, basically. And from that point forward, I knew my destiny was tied to that. I didn't
Mhm.
know exactly what direction or what that even meant. I just knew that, me wearing a Malcolm X hat every single day to school, me, writing Black Power on things. I used to write Black Power on things, and white folks probably thought I was crazy. But I definitely recognized that something was there that gave me some more deeper meaning and a deeper appreciation of what it meant to even navigate through this, white supremacist society in America.
Yeah, man, for sure, for sure. And I'm just thinking about how you were brought up. And then also, once again, just knowing how you were in college, knowing how you were just as a co-worker, at the school where we're at. I just keep thinking to myself, man, he's coming in with these strong Pan-Africanist views, with this fund of knowledge about the history. And then you and I know the history of this education system here in America. And I always like to tell people that when we talk about indoctrination, there's no greater system of indoctrination than this very education system that we find ourselves being a part of, unfortunately. And knowing who you are and knowing just how political the system is, did you come into it feeling like, man, I know who I am, and I'm not trying to compromise my values and principles just to stay in this system, but I know that there are going to be certain forces that I'll encounter that I'll need to combat. So I'm just kind of wondering what your mindset was when you first got into the space, knowing who you are.
Well, yeah, I mean, straight off the rip, I would be like, I'm surprised I'm going to be here longer than 10 years, right? Also, I was also very clear that, as long as I can reach one child, like that's how low, like that I came in with. I was just like, if I can just reach one child in 10 years, that would be more than most people can ever claim in their lives. And, having that mentality right from jump, I wasn't worried, whatever they talking about. And as soon as I stepped in, quite frankly, it was like, these people don't know what they're doing. The students were just going through the motions. Like, it was just like a situation where it's like, as soon as I hit the ground, I felt like I hit the ground running. Now, I think it was also partly to do with the fact that during that time period, after I graduated my bachelor's, before I got certified as a teacher, I was an after-school teacher and an administrative coordinator at a school that served women and children in transitional housing. And that experience definitely right there at the root of like my work, and the fact that my father was a social worker for DHS and a methadone social worker before that, and my mother was also in human services. I just kind of always had that in my veins. So like when I came into the classroom, I was 28. I picked the school I wanted to go to, the high school I would have went to if I stayed in Philly, because I went to a Philadelphia public school for middle school briefly. And if my parents didn't move me back to the suburbs, I purposely chose this school because it's the one I would have went to. And
Sure.
I was perfectly clear, like I want to work in a racially isolated school that folks, neglect, don't really care about the kids there, don't think that they're capable. And then once I got in there, I realized that's all true. And also at the same time, some of the most brilliant folks I have ever met were students that I taught in that building. And straight from rip, like I learned from them as much as they learned from me. And I just got better over time. So like, I wasn't really necessarily concerned about the system because I'd be like, whatever they can do, they've already done and probably do again. I'm not concerned about them folks. What I'm concerned about is what these students are going to learn, what the students are going to take away, how they're going to live their lives and implement things that we talk about in the classroom in a real way. And, luckily I was proven right, definitely. And it's real interesting. I was actually held up by other teachers real early as a really, really good teacher. So like, regardless of all the stuff I taught, like being told to take down my 10-point Black Panther program that I had outside my classroom, to like even like having, my classroom, you walked in, you was stepping in a Pan-African space. Like everybody knew that. Students who I didn't have would come in here in my classroom, like, whoa, like, who's this? Like, what's going on? I'm like, yo, you can come through, you know what I mean? If you got a substitute sometime, this is the Underground Railroad. And I would like teach them like that, as long as you're learning, as long as you're part of the process. So even after a while, and unfortunately this school closed in 2013. So I was only there for 4 years. And I love that school. And that's when me and you taught together briefly before I was called back to the school district. But at that school, I loved it. I lived in the neighborhood. Students would be like, oh, I saw you in the corner store the other day, Jimenez, or that my mom saw you, and it just became like that real family feeling. And I had no intention to leave, whatever. But unfortunately, Destiny had another path for me as a result. But that whole journey right from jump, I knew that I was here. I don't care what none of these people's talking about because they don't know what they're doing. And then after a while, once they peak game, it was already too late.
Man, yeah, that's dope, man. And I know that after you left from where we were working, you spent a lot of time in Kensington. And for those who never lived in Philly, like Kensington is one of the rougher places in the city. And at the time that I was there, I don't know if that's the case now, it was like a very heavily concentrated Latino population
Yeah.
at that time. But it was like, it wasn't a place where you could just go walk around. Like you had to really watch yourself. And a lot of kids coming from that area, they came from that neighborhood, so there were things that they were bringing into the school space that were reflective of where they were coming from. So I'm interested in knowing, during your time there, you spent a lot of time teaching out there, and was able to do a lot of positive things with the children. What are some moments that stick out for you during your time at Kensington?
Well, first, I got to tell you, bro, it took me about 2 years to adjust to that reality.
Yeah.
In my previous school, it was preaching to the choir. It was like, right off the rip. There, it was different. It different in the sense of like the value families even put on education of what it was. It was more of like everybody was just going through the motions. The kids, like, they were actually a little upset if you didn't allow them to go through the motions. Also mixed in with my kind of like this taste, right, for some of the more problematic aspects of Latino identity. And the school I taught at, it was like 60-40. And I would say about more like 60-40 Black, but like 20% of them kids had to learn that they were Black. And eventually that did happen, quite frankly. Like after being there, after those 2 years of adjustment, that really it was rough at first. Like I questioned if this is the path I had to go through. And then it started clicking. It started working. And I realized I had to approach it in a different angle. I taught my first white student there, right? I never taught a white student before. And from that experience, I definitely became much more able to talk about the same things I talked about in my previous school in a much more diverse audience, and have all of them understand what was going on with what was talking about, and then even negotiate their own positionality within that reality. You know what I mean? And so with that situation, the best things I remember doing, there never existed a Black History program there before I brought it there. You know what I mean? With the music teacher. Shout out to Miss Carr. I just gotta say that, and the dance teacher who came on, Miss Rawls. And then we would bring in African dance, and we would bring in the connection of the African root of a lot of dishes and identity pieces and music, and the students clung on to it at that point. Even the white students. I had a white student once who, during this Black History Month performance, read John Brown's speech before they hung him. And he went out of his way. He's like, I can do that. Like this white boy who did it, who now has passed, right? That reality of living in Kensington. But like that definitely allowed students to kind of like start to like, oh, what's going on in this classroom? I would play loud hip hop music down the hallway. Don't ask me how I got away with all this stuff. And at the same time, students would like come and be interested. And then the school I was at, like, the first school was like an old building. Like that's part of the reason why they closed it down. This new school that I went to, it was like 3 years old when I stepped in. It was a beautiful space, natural light. Like I use my room like a store, right? You don't really need to ask where things is at. Everything that you needed to know where it was at, you knew where to go, right? It was clean all the time. Like I made sure there was nothing on the floor. Like I took pride in that classroom. And then it was reflected in how the students oriented themselves towards the class. They loved the space. They would even say, like, I feel safe here, Jimenez. I feel like I'm part of this conversation that's much larger than myself. And I was there for close to a decade. And, by the end, I had no intention of leaving the classroom. But, circumstances of COVID and everything, if we get into that, definitely changed the course in which I was in. But the space that I cultivated with the students allowed really hardcore conversations. And it also allowed them to even challenge their other teachers. And it just over time, you just get better at it. You know what it is. I was already past the 5-year mark when I got over that 2-year thing. So I was already thinking, okay, how can I improve this? Which way I can go? And even to the point where I overthought them in the sense of, going through the motions and checking off boxes and not thinking deeply or critically. I would then change it and be like, well, 30% of your grade is based off of this rubric. And I call it the woke rubric, which is now probably a cuss word to folks. But then there was like 5 steps, right? There was a sleep, there was drowsy, there was disoriented, then you awakened, then you woke. And then I had a description of what that meant. I would have them self-evaluate themselves. I would have conversations about where I thought they were based on conversation and what they wrote. And it was deep, man, because like that allowed them to see, like, I don't really care if you're able to check off all the boxes in a quick way. I stopped collecting. If you absent from school, like, I'm not going to go chase after you to go the assignment that you missed unless it's like a major assessment. Like, and I'm also not going to give you a grade for the copied work you try to give me. Like, that's totally up to you. And so like those type of structures, I had to readjust myself with the reality of teaching in a place like Kensington, where there was a lot of like transiency and a lot of language barriers. And over time, I just got better at the craft of just becoming a good teacher. So like I definitely got to credit Kensington of not only like the first school, definitely I cut my teeth becoming an educator, but Kensington taught me how to really become an educator to diverse audiences, simplify the concepts in a way where folks can understand, and also elicit some type of real deal Holyfield conversations. To this day, students tell me that they still process and still appreciate.
So just looking at the timeline, so you mentioned COVID, so we're talking 2020, 2021, and you said that played a role in you making your transition eventually into the school district of Philadelphia. Now I'm thinking about just the change in leadership that's taken place from the time that I first got to Philly up until where we are now. So when I first got to Philly, I want to say Paul Ballas was the superintendent when I was there. And then eventually it got to Arlene Ackerman, God rest her soul. And then at some point, Dr. Height came in right before I left Philly to go to Boston. And then now we have a new superintendent. I'm trying to remember the brother's name. Oh, what was his name?
Dr. Wallington.
Yeah, there we go. So there's been a lot of instability at the superintendent position with the school district of Philadelphia. And there's been some controversy too along the way. So I'm curious to know what prompted you to want to make the move to the district, knowing what had taken place during your time in the classroom.
Well, first I gotta say, Dr. Height was actually there for 10 years.
Long
time. So like towards the end of that, that's when I did come in. So he already, George, I consider myself a George Floyd hire, right? So like folks knew who I was. I testified in front of the school board. Like I co-founded like Black Lives Matter at school, which then became national. Philadelphia was the first to do it. So like folks knew that I was on the radical side of things, right? So actually during COVID 2020, that school year, I received a call saying, we know you don't want to leave the classroom. Could you identify someone to kind of continue work? Because my homie Yasin Muhammad was in the social studies curriculum office at the time. And he brought me in to do some curriculum work, to run some professional developments. Like I was running new hire orientation for new social studies teachers for a couple of years. So like I already had that experience. And then also that year, we had this new principal at the school I was at, and she was super fragilistic, expialidocious, problematic. Right from jump. And I was the building rep at the school. So right there from jump, it was clashing. So that was happening. I get that call and COVID. So I was teaching to like a screen full of black, you know what I mean? So like I turned to my wife, and my wife's like, yo, it's probably about that time that you consider doing it. So I reached back and said, I'm interested. Got the position as a social studies curriculum specialist for the school district. And at that time, Height was like in his last, couple of years, like but he already established a framework for like equity position, a DEI office. And so like he was moving towards that position, and a lot of folks, and Height was real good at this, like he gave people space to kind of operate with their magic within their space. So as a result of that, I was able to really, hit the ground running as soon as I came into the office. I started Africana Studies lecture and workshop series. I was able to double down on the fact that we require African American history for graduation in Philadelphia, yet there's no real guidance, and some of the most problematic stuff was happening in classes titled African American history in the school district of Philadelphia. And so right away from jump, I was able to make that a priority for the department. And after about a year and a half, I was able then to apply to become director, and then became the first director of social studies for the school district of Philadelphia in 9 years. So it just showed you that that work was valued, that we really started making some headway right from jump, in the sense of turning some of the stuff in the department that has been not long neglected into kind of focused. And I was unapologetic about it. I also need to shout out my boss, Dr. Nashawana Francis Thompson, super supportive right from jump, really leaned into the work in a real intellectually honest way, and even challenges me to really be purposeful with how I'm doing things, how I'm looking at things, and making sure that we are evaluating how effective we are when we're even approaching this. And obviously, as an educator, you do that with your students, but doing it with teachers, doing it on this level became a whole nother conversation. So I just lucked out by having a great boss just right from jump, and also being supported by many people who recognized kind of like the work that I was doing was getting positive attention, not only from teachers, but from the community. And then students were also appreciative. So all that being said, that's how that happened. That's what caused me to leave the classroom. I can tell you right now, if one of those things weren't in place, I would probably still be in the classroom right now. So I recognize that as a much deeper thing going on right there that I don't have control over. And right now, quite frankly, I don't know what would happen after this, because my goal was just simply to become a teacher. All this stuff, this is just icing on the cake at this point.
And that's what I'm saying, brother, because just knowing you, just the work you do with the union, and just how radical you are, to kind of see you in this new space, it's like, okay, this is gonna be interesting. Cause I'm
Yeah.
sure you may have had some ideological clashes in terms of just how you view the curriculum, and maybe how others at 440 North Broad Street view the curriculum, you know. So I'm thinking that, but I'm also thinking that if we're really going to talk about agency, students have an agency of what they're learning. And I think there's no better way to build it than through the humanities, whether it's social studies, whether it's the ELA, because you have to question sources. You have to interrogate what you're reading. You have to interrogate what you're watching and the messages that you're receiving. I'm wondering if you're able to have the opportunity to have these conversations with other subject matters, because a lot of it is very cross curricular. We think about social studies.
Oh yeah, right from jump. Before I even became director, we worked closely with the ELA department as they were rewriting their curriculum. They actually even, adopted Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler as a senior text to read. They also identified some other things aligned with what was going on in our rewrite of the social studies curriculum. People's history of the United States in 8th grade for them students. You know what I mean? Like books align with the fact that we were reframing the way social studies should be taught in schools. Unfortunately, now with our new leadership, that is now going to be moved again and changed again. But for that brief 2-year period, and might I add, the only scores that rose in the district at that time was in ELA and literacy. I would argue partly due to the revamp of the English curriculum. But like we were very purposeful. We even tag team with ELA specialists for professional developments. The ELA specialist did it with a social studies specialist on Frederick Douglass Day, a presentation on looking and reading and understanding and comprehend what he was talking about, but also the social studies aspect around that. So like right from jump, it was a very collaborative situation. And one of the benefits of being social studies, the best subject, but also the most neglected required subjects, is that we have much more flexibility in the way we approach how we want folks to learn about it, what we want folks to know. And the ideological things didn't really come into and still not really that harsh, especially in Philadelphia, because Philadelphia is one of the places they look around the country and they see these like 18 states banning even conversations like this. And Philadelphia's like, okay, we're going to double down on that. We're going to go harder. And I've just been benefited from that wheel of time, kind of like that operating at this juncture. So like that's another situation that I do not take for granted. And also I'm not, I even when I came in, I was like, well, if I still here in 2 years, I'm going to do this before they fire me. I still kind of operated with that mind state, because really at the end of the day, it ain't about my well-being. It's about the work that needs to be done in the benefit of the students that we serve in the school district of Philadelphia. All that other stuff just is noise to me. And whether you like that or not, you don't bang with that or not, like, oh, whatever, like there's many other reasons why you shouldn't be banging with things. And for me, it's like that's what I'm focused on, from a teacher to the position I find myself now, to the activism that I'm involved in throughout the city of Philadelphia.
So this season, Identity Talk for Educators Live will be including ad spots for businesses, products, and events that are adding significant value to their communities. And here's the catch. You don't have to be an educator or an education-based business to be a part of this. We're looking for people who are just doing great work in the community, and we want to use our platform as a way to amplify their work. So if you are an entrepreneur, or you know of an entrepreneur who is doing just that, bring them in our direction. Have them reach out to us. If they want to learn more about their ad spots and how they can get themselves promoted on this platform, they can contact myself, Kwame at identitytalkforeducators.com. I'll say it one more time. It is Kwame at identitytalkforeducators.com. Hope to hear from you, and let's keep on amplifying our work and building each other up. Yeah, man, for sure. And you mentioned Africana studies, but then earlier in the conversation, you were talking about how we shouldn't call it African American studies. And I want to talk about that for a little bit, because I think I know where you're going with this, particularly as two brothers with a very Pan-Africanist mindset. I could see the intentionality around the language, right? So I'm wondering, when you say Africana studies, is that a cue for folks to understand that we need to be inclusive of histories that have happened throughout the African diaspora? Because sometimes when we think about African American studies, we're very American centric, like what's happened, with Jim Crow here, what happened during Reconstruction, what happened during Civil Rights Movement. These are things that we learned when we're going through school. But there are things that were happening in other countries within the diaspora. We talk about Afro Latino movements. We talk about what's happening on the continent, the Pan-Africanist movement, with a lot of the Pan-Africanist leaders, and how some of the Pan-Africanist leaders were coming to the States, like a Kwame Nkrumah went to Lincoln and got his degree and was getting all these different ideas from the likes of MLK and other leaders at that time, and bringing it back to Ghana to implement. Like that's history that you don't really see that often within the curriculum in the States. So I love for you to just share the value of Africana studies and why you believe it has the ability to save the world.
Well, first, I gotta give that whole idea up to my homie Kwame Boatnag in the UK. We did some collaboration here in the States with the UK educators around Black history, and me and him just clicked right away, started sharing books and ideas, and we decided to just have a couple of Zoom calls, just me and him. And in our conversation, he's like, bro, in the British accent, he's like, I believe Africana studies could save the world. And I was like, yo, you don't mind if I use that, right? He's like, nah, man, nah, go ahead, because like that speaks to what I actually believe, right? Not only do I believe in the strength of learning this history and the interconnection, right? The trans-temporal connection, if not, with the large, with the diaspora. I also believe that this type of knowledge and the lessons that folks learn, not only here in America, but like you were just bringing up, anti-colonial struggles, the struggles in the Caribbean and Latin
Yeah.
America, all those
Right.
lessons, we need to put that in one storehouse and talk about that in across countries and across regions and across languages, right? And so when I was calling it Africana Studies, I recognized, like, in America, we are very American centric. Everything revolves around us, da da da. And then as a result, what about CLR James? What about Eric Williams? You know what I mean? What about America Cabral? What about, you know what I mean? The list goes on. Frantz Fanon. Like, you talking about folks who didn't live in the States, that had an analysis that was built and based in internationalism. And I would even argue, when we're even talking about what happened and occurred in the States, that was also international in scope, right? There's not a coincidence. King and them were very clear that, this is the Cold War. You claim all these type of things. Are you actually going to stay in up with it? Because it looks weak. It's no coincidence Malcolm wanted to go to UN and file charges against the US for what they were doing to Black folks, because that conversation is not just here. It involves all of us across the world. And that goes right back to the intellectual genealogy in which I derive my own identity and my own self from, right? And when you look at it from that scope, that's why we call it, that's why I call it Africana Studies. That's why it's called that. And even when you call it, it's not focused on just history. You get into anthropology, you get into psychology, you get into educational theory, you get into all of these type of ideas that aren't just confined to just a simple, like, history. This happened, then that happened, then this happened. You get into the deepness of what that worldview actually produces, right? The Africana worldview, which is different, and it's based in collectivism, as we look at the Eurocentric worldview, which is based on individualism and competition and malice towards your neighbor. When you look at the Africana worldview, you start to get into questions of, like, is this the way we need to go? And the way the world is right now, with what I described with the Eurocentric worldview, we're killing ourselves. This world is killing itself, in the sense of the extraction of resources, in the sense of the environment about to be on full collapse, about all the wars everywhere and rumors of war everywhere. When you look at the Africana worldview, you get into a much more deeper conversation about why we are humans, why we are here together on a single idea and a single plan, that we don't look at God as outside ourselves. That's part of everything and part of us. And that knowledge within itself orients yourselves to the world differently, right? And so when I say Africana Studies can save the world, that's my argument, y'all. Because if we don't ingest that, if we don't really live that type of life, then we just doubling down on obviously what's killing us.
The world. I think it's true, given what you mentioned, because when you think about the United States of America, it's set up in a way such that white folks don't have to do anything. All we're doing to each other as Black folks is self-inflicted. That's just how the system's set up, right? We think about the internalized racism. We think about just the anti-Blackness and all that we inherit just through the system. It causes us to have conflicts with one another. So when that's taking place, how can we embrace Pan-Africanism if that's all taking place? We got to fight through that in order to realize that we're actually all part of the same family. Yep. But now we're questioning each other's Blackness. We're questioning where we're coming from. You have continental Africans having beef with Africans who are in America and so forth. So there's so much that we have to unpack there before we can get to a place where we can even embrace this idea of Pan-Africanism, thus being able to embrace Africana studies as the remedy for getting to a place where we can start to combat white supremacy within the country and beyond.
Word. And like if you read like Asa Hillard, right, probably one of the best educational theorists, right? Read Jacob Carruthers, right, and ASCAP, folks from ASCAP and what they put out. If you read all these type of folks Amos Wilson, like the falsification of African consciousness, you start to really get to the very root, I would argue, of what needs to be understood and also implemented within our communities to really move forward, and not in the sense of progress in the Eurocentric term, but in the sense of reprogramming ourselves to recognize like success isn't copying. Success isn't just redoing what has done, which created the circumstances that we find ourselves in today, right? And a lot of people think that's the measurement of success, right? To get mad at the robbers because we don't get enough percentage of the robbery. Like that ain't the game, right? We have to rethink and restructure what we actually value, right? And this also goes, like you said, a lot of brothers on the continent, right? Well, the goal isn't simply just to replicate what the West has created. The idea is to create something truly unique that isn't resting on the same type of premise that the West used to justify the colonialism to begin with. And as long as folks just keep on playing their game, we're going to have situations like what happened to Claudine Gay. It don't matter how many degrees. It don't matter how successful you are. They take that John in a minute and erase you from history. And folks don't know that, and I think when you look at Africana studies, you learn these things and you also build off of what folks already discovered to be true. I saw earlier on a LinkedIn page, somebody talking about Phyllis Wheatley and how great she was and write poetry. And I always remind myself with Phyllis Wheatley, yeah, she published her first book as a Black woman in America, but did you know she died 11 years later? Did you know she died in poverty after her husband died, after her 2 children died in poverty? And you want to turn around and hold this up like without that full story? If we don't get that full story, then we don't really truly understand the nature in which she was actually brought up within the society, not only being kidnapped and took from her family at 7, 8 years old, but also then taught Latin and, read poems to George Washington, all that nonsense, who was a slave owner, and then not told the whole story. Well, then she died. You know what I mean? And that is the reality of this situation. And if we don't have full eyes wide open, we're going in there and we hitting against a brick wall simply just to try to be like, hey, let us in. And it's like, nah, man, you can't dismantle master's house using master's tools, right? To quote Audre Lorde, you need to really get to at the very root foundation, and understand this whole thing is horrible and treacherous, and we need to do the whole thing all over again. And when I say the whole thing all over again, I'm talking about the way we treat each other, the way we view God, the way we view our own self-worth and our own humanity and the humanity of others. And as long as we just stuck in this cycle of believing this Eurocentric way is the way, then we're going to forever be worshiping white Jesus and then going down the aisle and wondering why we suffering the way we suffer.
That's true, man. And when we think about the idea of Africana studies saving the world, all we have to do is just think about what's happening right now. We're having all these conversations around critical race theory, culturally responsive education, anything that centers the humanity of Black folks and other folks of color, we have to push back against. Yep. And it's not just right wingers and conservatives. I mean, even folks that are in the quote unquote liberal and progressive space, they doing some of the same things. It's just being manifested in a different way. So it's not just that cut and dry. Now, when I look at some of the brothers, some of the ancestors we mentioned, like a Dr. Asa Hilliard, Frantz Fanon, W.E.B. Du Bois, like the list goes on and on. When you read their books, they were already giving us the blueprint to what's happening right now. Yep. They had the answers. That's why I think there's so much censorship right now when it comes to Black books and other books that are banned from other BIPOC communities, right? Because the answers are there. Yeah. They're in there. So rather than giving our people access to this information, let's find a way to keep that information away from them. And if they do get a hold of it, we're going to distort the truth in a way that fits our agenda and keeps the narrative in our favor. So there's a lot happening there. And And I think, and I just want to kind of get your thoughts on what's been taking place for, I guess, the past 4 years with regards to these political attacks against critical race theory and just Black intellectual scholarship, because that's what we're really talking about too.
Yeah, no, I tell you right from back, these folks don't really know what critical race theory is. They just throwing this stuff out here, because all critical race theory is an analysis of systematic racism, how systematic racism operates. You know, it was in the Kerner Commission report when they said that it was structural racism that created conditions that caused the riots in that 1960s. So, like, this information been out here for a minute. Derek Bell, who's considered a father of critical race theory, he didn't even really call it critical race theory. Eventually became that, but he recognized there were certain things. He was a civil rights attorney. Like, we've made all these gains, yet still nothing has really happened. And he said we have to look at what structures exist that cause that this reality still, is happening. And so his analysis through law, right? Because he was a lawyer, a law professor, looking at through that scope. That's how it all came about. And of course, it has ventured and really manifested itself through feminist studies and all these other studies that come out of it, out of critical race theory. But at its very root, that's all it is, man. But like folks who are in opposition to really Black empowerment, really in opposition to challenging their own mythological kind of understanding of what their society is all about, they get threatened when you really point out, like, oh, wait a minute, how can this country be founded on freedom when we're talking about out of the first 72 years, 50 years of it saw a slave owner in the White House? Oh, yeah, slaves built the White House. Oh, yeah, those people owned slaves, right? As Thomas Jefferson was writing All Men Are Created Equal, he had his slaves in that room probably. So, like, you talk about that reality, that goes to the very core of the mythological identity that most people who consider themselves white weren't even here to begin with or considered white at first. And so when they became white, this became kind of the malaise of what it meant to be an American, right? Which is synonymous with whiteness, quite frankly. And so when we see that reality, it's just like, yo, man, it goes to the core. And we see this during Reconstruction after slavery ended. Folks, when you see Black people start having the first public schools in the South, started becoming elected to Senate and House seats and everything like that, white folks back then called that reverse racism. You know what I mean? There's documents about them, and they would show pictures of Black people like drinking and eating watermelon in the Senate building, like drawings of it. Even though that didn't happen, they would use that in order to kind of justify kind of the exclusion of Black people, which happened after a brief about 7-8 years of actual real Reconstruction going down. And then we see that backlash again after the Civil Rights Movement, right? With Reagan, even arguably with Nixon, right? Right. And so, like, after Obama, and I'm not even a big fan of Obama, you see Donald Trump. So, like, when Donald Trump got elected, people were like, oh my God, how can this country do this? Be like, yo, this is America. This America has always been anti-immigrant, especially when we're talking about non-white immigrants, right? There's always one of the first laws in this country was the Naturalization Act of 1790 that said only white men can become citizens of the United States. And so, like, when you're talking about this settled colony in which we exist in, and folks coming in and who they let in and who they excluded, Chinese Exclusion Act, the Immigration Act of 1924, non-whites weren't even allowed to immigrate to America like that until like the 1960s. So, like, when you're talking about all these type of things, it's like when you actually talk about that history, when you actually talk about the facts, right, of racial wealth inequality being dramatic and asking to address it, it gets to the very core of the mythological understanding in which people find their whole being on. And it's like, oh, well, wait a minute. You're being racist by talking about race. Martin King talked about people getting judged by the content of the character and not the color of their skin. And they forget that Martin Luther King lived 5 years after that and also said things like, white people ain't putting in the work that they need to do in order to actually create the situation where Black people can get free within this society. He was disillusioned when he died about this whole situation. So, like, when we're building off of that reality and then they turn around and start attacking this, that is a direct result of kind of an upsurge after George Floyd of white folks reading this stuff. That is more an internal kind of conflict within their own community going down right now that we're witnessing, and less to do really, quite frankly, with Black people. We're just the victims and side pieces of their conversation, which unfortunately has always been the fact within this society.
Yeah, man, this is so good. It's so good. And even with Dr. King, they talk so much about, letter to Birmingham. They talk about I have a dream speech, but it's like you mentioned, right before he was assassinated, he talked about performative activism. He talked about the fact that white folks weren't holding up the end of the bargain, right? Yep. And then when you mentioned Dr. Bell talked about this too with interest conversions. Yep. How you have a lot of white folks that do engage in Black causes, but they only do it because there's an incentive for them. And usually it's monetary. Yep. Like, we still see this today. Even when we think about a lot of the school districts, we've been talking about teacher diversity for how long now? Trying to get more Black educators into our districts nationwide, 2%. And yet we're still trying to figure out how to recruit Black folks in, but we don't do a good job of retaining them when they get into these districts. Yep. Why is that? What's the motivation for doing that? There's usually an incentive tied to it. Yeah. Because I know for me, I was a diversity quota when I got to Boston Public Schools. I can admit that, but I also knew that I was a damn good teacher as well. And that's why I was able to stay. But before, it was about getting those numbers up. So when we think about just this conversation and just where we are, we still have a lot of white folks who are doing it in order to make themselves feel good, in order to prioritize their comfort. But it's not doing anything to disrupt systems that they have greatly benefited from for the time that they've been built. So just want to point that out there.
Yeah, and let me just say, some of my closest friends is white folks. So it's like, and I'm unapologetic about the conversations I have with them about these things. You know what I mean? And it's like, and granted, I lost a lot of friends because of that. And be like, especially when I was growing up in the high school, and be like, after Trump got elected and everything like that, folks started coming at me and be like, "Oh, you're being racist against white people." And be like, "Yo, I had a Malcolm X hat on when we was kids. Y'all called me Ishmael X. What do you think that was about, bro? Just because I can articulate it better, just because I am in positions in order to like make that a more magnified world. I'm not against you as a white person. I'm against the very structure in which created the situation where folks consider themselves white." And quite frankly, I would even double down and be like, if a person can't admit that Black people were never meant to be free within American society, it doesn't matter what race or ethnicity they are, Black, white, purple with pink polka dots, they hold anti-Black views. Because the very root of it is like, you can't even acknowledge that. And then you start, the culture and single parent homes and all this other nonsense that relates to the very fact that you're saying something's wrong with Black people. You ain't saying something's wrong with the system that created conditions that create those things in the first place. So you can miss me with all that. And so the white folks I know who actually still talk to me, they acknowledge that reality. And so like, that's where it comes to the humanness of it all, right? And I think that when we're talking about that, we can't just expect people overnight to wake up and be like, I understand now, which a lot of folks pretended they did because they read How to Be an Anti-Racist, which I have my own critiques about. But, it's deeper than that, man. It's like, how many friends you got? Like friends that you invite over your house. White people are the most segregated, racially isolated group in America. Do we talk about that? Do we talk about the fact that they're actually record suicide rates and they're dying like crazy right now? Do we talk about that? Nah, it's all framed with Black people killing each other and all this other type of nonsense when it's like, yo, people are people are people. What conditions did y'all create with this nonsense to begin with? And then even your own folk are dying within it. So it's like, when it comes to it at the end of the day, man, we got to be very clear, because like even me having and saying that right now, I bet there'll be folks that listen and be like, oh, he hates white people. And it's like, really, man? You missing the whole point. And that is like that cognitive dissonance that even Fanon talks about, that psychologists talk about, where it's like you can accept some things that fit into your worldview, but when it comes to shaking your worldview and recognizing that a lot of what your worldview is informed by a bunch of myth, informed by a lot of like ideas of whiteness, which is a created identity that is ever changing. We even have Latinos calling themselves white now. So like when we're talking about this reality, it's like, yo, man, you got to understand that whiteness, when you accept that identity, just by default, you're also accepting anti-Black views. And that's part of that identity. So what does that identity mean to you, right? And understand your positionality, understand that if you really about it, if you really about your friends and other folks that you consider you're close to, if you're a white person, what are you doing in order to fight against that? When your colleagues say racist stuff around you, you check them? Do you check your family when they orient themselves like that? Because I can tell you right now, all those type of conversations go down in these households with each other, around each other. And if you ain't saying something to speak up about, you part of the problem to begin with, man.
Man, there it is, man. So then I want to ask you this, man. Where do we go from here, bro? We know what the issues are. The issues have been around for as long as we can remember. So where do we go from here?
Yeah, man. Right from jump, like when I became an educator, part of that was that was my solution, right? That like we have to recognize that we starting not on the ground floor, man. We starting at negative 1,725 at this point, and we need to start not digging ourselves out, but start building something that's different than what we're existing in right now. And that's going to take generations after us in order to move that, right? Like it's like a boat going full speed. Like you got to turn that John slowly over in order for folks to actually understand that, like, yo, we got to move. So the first thing I believe is the best route forward is educate, agitate, organize, right? We need to put people in the positions where they can be in multiracial coalitions, but then also in spaces where it's just Black folks talking about the issues that even in those multiracial spaces are tiring at times. And also the recognition that we got a lot of growing to do in the sense of learning, that we need to learn from where Martin King led off. Not learning the I Have a Dream speech, learn about Martin King 68, 67, right? Mm-hmm. There's a reason why he was against militarism, materialism, and racism, right? The three triplets. But like then we also need to recognize that Martin Luther King statue in DC was funded by Boeing, Walmart, and JP Morgan. Last time I checked, those are the three things that he was against at that time, right? So we need to challenge ourselves to be critical of even how systems and structures are trying to placate us, right? And also start to bring in some of them folks who are coming into the country now who are like trying to orient themselves around race. Be like, what do you mean what race I am? I'm Honduran, or I'm nah, bro, you're like indigenous. You know what what happened to indigenous folk? Do you understand? Do you know the indigenous language that your ancestors spoke, right? We need to really be leaning in to really challenging our ways and mores in which that unfortunately we have adopted at this point. And then also recognize like we have no friends at the end of the day. For Black folks, at the end of that, the very spectrum of hierarchy that white supremacy has created, Black folks are at the bottom. So like, yeah, we can have unity with Asians, we can have unity with brown folk, but at the end of the day, a good amount of them still look at us as beneath them. And that we need to build with indigenous folks, we need to build with each other. And then while we're doing that, at the same time, educate these other folks and be like, yo, are you, and especially in the American context, not to be American centric right now, but always be like, yo, are you talking about the America of George Washington or the America of Harriet Tubman? Are you talking about the God of George Washington? You talking about the God of Harriet Tubman? Because last time I checked, Harriet Tubman was praying for freedom and justice for all people, and George Washington was praying for more of his, more wealth, more exploitation, more control. And so like when we have these type of stark differences, and as folks start to be like, gain that American identity, be like, yo, what American identity are you talking about, bro? Because last time I checked, if you ain't talking about the America Harriet Tubman, you probably the enemy.
That's right. Facts. Man, Brother Ishmael, we could talk all day,
I
man.
know,
We
right?
really can. But I want to end with this. How do you stay true to the teacher in you?
I remember my students, man. I remember the lessons that I learned from my students at my first school in Kensington, um, and their dreams and their wishes when we really got to them quiet moments when we talked about what's important, right? What's real, how sometimes it's easy to get lost, right? And my wife holds me holds me very strictly to the thing and checks me when she feels that I'm getting too arrogant with what I think I know, because really the wise man that knows something knows that they know nothing at all. And I try to remember that when it comes in. And at the end of the day, man, we ain't doing this for self-aggrandizement. We ain't doing it for no paycheck or no job. We doing it for the people, man. And until all my people are free, you
That's
just,
right.
it doesn't matter what happens to me. That's how I remember, man.
Man, there it is, man. But hey, brother, man, I appreciate you for coming on and just sharing your gems and wisdom. It's always a pleasure. Before you leave, let folks know how they can connect with you, because you're doing some dope work, man. Like, I know you had a chance to connect with Dr. Givens up at Cambridge. So shout out to Dr. Jarvis Givens. If you haven't copped Carter G. Woodson
Yeah,
and the
fugitive
Art of
pedagogy.
Lactation,
Yeah,
yeah, Fugitive Pedagogy, like, you got to get that book. And I know you've done some work with other universities as well, so you've been around, bro. So just let people know how they can connect with you and how they can build.
yeah, definitely. And I want to first say, before I give my handles, that I'm also going to share my email, that we also are in the school district of Philadelphia. Every time we have an Africana Studies lecture and workshop series, which is about like once a month on a Saturday, anybody can attend. So it doesn't matter if you're in Philadelphia. Like, we had brothers from Kenya join us last time. We had somebody from New Zealand tune in once. You know what I mean? So
Wow,
like we are trying to have a intergenerational, cross-class, cross-race conversation rooted in Africana studies. So like our next one is not until March, because we got the Black History Month thing to do, which is going to take up a lot of the time. But in March 16th will be our next one. And I always, pump this stuff on social media. So you can follow me on Instagram at ishx19 or at ish19. That is on Instagram. If you still do the Twitter thing, I ain't going to call X because there's only one X that I acknowledge, but it's going to be at teacher-ish-x. Again, at teacher-ish-x. And that's on Twitter. And obviously, just Google my name on Facebook or LinkedIn. You can find me and we can connect on there, man. And please reach out. My email is ishx12@gmail.com. Again, that's ishx12@gmail.com. And then we can connect and build, man, because it's going to take all of us to make this happen.
that's right. And we'll make sure to put that information in the episode notes once this episode comes out. Man, Brother Ishmael, once again, thank you, man, for coming on. And we're gonna have to do this again in the near future, man. So much more to unpack and talk about.
Definitely.
All right, man. Take care,
Brother.
my brother.
You too, bro.
Yes, sir. All right, y'all. So we about to wrap up another episode of our Day and Talk for Educators Live. And as always, I wish you all good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are in the world. And we're gonna do this again another time. Peace out, y'all.